this alliance that has existed between organized labor and the Democratic Party seems to be bringing diminishing returns from the perspective of workers and labor, and yet the Democratic Party, the labor movement robustly supported Obama both in 2008 and 2012, mobilized the vote to get him into office, and then he promptly sort of abandoned their ideals and their objectives. At what point do we need to question this alliance and see if?
Well, I mean, clearly, I think the you have to be willing to do what the Republican right did, is take some defeats. That is, you challenge. If you can, like Rahm Emanuel would be. He's a Democrat, but he should be clearly challenged in many different ways by the labor movement, and very explicitly. And that would mean in some places where Republicans would win because you split the liberal vote. And I think that you have to do that. I think that's the kind of part of the cost of making that challenge, and it's be prepared for that. That has to be done. It's difficult, obviously, because when the right is on the warpath, that's why the labor movement does, in fact, support the Democrats. I once gave a talk, and Trump was in the audience. I said that labor should be an unpredictable and unreliable ally of the Democrats. I mean, here I have two minds, and I used to have a different position. I do think that it would be best if labor had its own party, and was would be the pole around which liberals would then go to link up, and that was what the British Labour Party was like a generation or two ago. The problem is it just sometimes the game is rigged, and in the U.S. the electoral game is rigged against third parties. I mean, that's a fact, and I've sort of had to come to that conclusion. So, given that structure, what can labor do within it? And I think it. For example, here's one example of something that worked in Los Angeles and in California. The Latino service union element of the labor movement won an internal battle, first within the Los Angeles Federation of Labor, and then within the Democratic Party of California by challenging more conservative Democrats, and it's become that, and that's the reason that California is a blue state, because the Anglo leadership of the labor movement and the Anglo leadership of so much of the Democratic Party was deposed by this new labor movement, and that kind of thing has to happen in other parts of the country.
I wonder also to what extent you think that labor's sort of diminishing clout in national politics and reduced relevancy in the lives of working people, how much of that is due to poor strategic compromises that institutional organized labor has either made or been forced to make, whether it was purging communists from their ranks during McCarthyism, to defanging and merging the CIO with the AFL, to failing to fully capitalize on the rights consciousness that arose in the 60s and 70s. You talked a lot about that in State of the Union.
Right. Yeah. Well, partly all of that. I do. I mean, I think that there were some self-inflicted wounds, unquestionably. Now, 3 generations ago, the fight with the communists and just sort of purging that, or actually more important, I think, really in the 60s was the official labor movement's support for the Vietnam War, which turned off an entire generation against labor. So there are those self-inflicted wounds. But I think that, and my book makes this clear, that the structure of law, even more than globalization or things of that sort, but the structure of the law, and then following the law, just corporate policy, has been such that it's really confined labor to this very narrow terrain. So let me just give you an example. The United Food and Commercial Workers, trying to change the behavior of Walmart, and maybe even organize some workers at Walmart, has created an organization called Our Walmart, for Walmart workers to join. Now, the food and they clearly support it and fund it, etc. The Walmart wants to has gone to court to argue that our Walmart is a trade union, and and United Food and Commercial Workers has countered, no, it is not a trade union, it's just an organization. Now, why that would seem like the opposite perspective. The reason is that if our Walmart is defined as a trade union by the courts, then Walmart knows exactly how to defeat it, and then it's constrained as to what it can do. Whether it can have a picket line, whether it can actually can call on other workers to support it. It just many things it can't do. It ghettoizes it. So that's why whether worker centers or our Walmart or all sorts of other kind of quasi work group are the people supporting them say, no, we are not trade unions. We don't want to be trade unions, because once you're in that box, then you're going to be defeated. So that's part of that's part of the law, and that law can only be changed by really two things. One, a real kind of mobilization from below, and secondly, a realization by these Democrats that if they want that party to really succeed, and maybe not just capture the White House, but capture a lot more, they have to support this. They have to support this movement. And so, I mean, a example of that that's working to some extent is the fast food, Fight for 15 kind of thing. There, it's clearly it's supported by trade unions, but clearly it's more than just a union movement kind of thing.
So, what do you think? I mean, would there be any benefit, let's say, to organized labor at least making the threat to the Democratic Party that, hey, listen, don't take our support for granted. We might turn elsewhere, maybe to the Green Independent Party, or would that be nakedly transparent? And the Democrats?
No, they've done that. I think that's a good idea. They should do. They did that in Arkansas with what was that? The Blanche Lincoln. She lost, but the union movement challenged her because she had not supported either labor law reform or even I think Obamacare. I'm not sure which. Anyway, so Blanche Lincoln was clearly kind of one of the fewer Southern Democrats around. But yeah, so I'm in favor of that. And even they get defeated, so or rather Republican comes in. So that kind of thing. I mean, the thing is that third party, except in New York State. Whether it's green, whether you call it a Green Party or a Labor Party or whatever you want to call it, the structure is rigged. That's all. Now, maybe some people might not agree with that and say, well, yes, it's sort of rigged, but it's very important to have a third party that'll get 5% or 10% of the vote or something. Libertarians seem to be doing that. I'm certainly open to that argument, but right now I see that fight taking place inside the Democratic Party.
So what effect, you mentioned globalization, what effect has globalization had on sort of this Keynesian argument for unionism about putting income into the pockets of the working classes so that they can spend?
Yeah. I have two lines of response to that. Yes, on the one hand, right, there's the argument is that when production's taking place in South China, and we're buying the stuff here, if Keynesianism becomes less effective, that is, if for whatever reason you have a tax reduction for working class people, or even raise the minimum wage for them, the multiplier effect is not so great because they buy more stuff that's produced in South China. Well, that's good. That's okay, but it doesn't multiply. It isn't as effective as if the stuff had been made in the U.S., where then the workers in the U.S. will be getting it. So, Keynesianism has become somewhat less effective, although as the Great Recession demonstrated, and Krugman has made this point many times, the initial stimulus, although too small, was itself effective. I mean, just pouring money into the budgets of states and localities to pay school teachers and whatnot was pretty important, and made the recession a little less severe than it might have been. The second thing is this about globalization, and this I'm working on this right now. The way globalization works is the way these supply chains, which I think are at the core of a globalized economy, is that Nike in the U.S. or Apple in the U.S. does not own the factories. They don't. Nike make. They don't actually make shoes. They design them and sell them, but they're all made by other firms. Same is true for Apple. Do they make computers? No. They contract with Foxconn to get them. So what's the real question today, and it's true in fast food, is who's the boss?
Mm.
And the boss is not who it used to be. How do you regulate? How do you get Apple to either bring the production back to the U.S. or to have the wages of the workers in China doubled in size, which would then again have an impact on the U.S. economy. We'd sell more stuff to them. We have this what's called this fissured workplace where we have very tightly organized, vertically integrated supply chains, but legally they're composed of differing units. So it means that a certain kind of regulatory impress, which used to work, in the mid 20th century. How do you regulate these if they're different work, and if they're different companies with different employers and they're in different countries? So that's the other side. That's another aspect of that mid-century liberalism, Keynesian, you could call it that too. It's not working. And what we need to do is create new structures which will make the Apples and the Nikes and the Walmarts responsible legally, fiscally, etc., for their entire supply chain.
So the genie may be out of the bottle at this point, but in your estimation, has globalization been a mistake? These cross-border trade agreements that have happened, NAFTA and otherwise. I mean, have those made it? Have those been basically strategic benefit for corporations, and it's made them, like you say, sort of slippery opponents for the labor movement? And if go ahead.
I mean, it's obvious the conditions under which trade will take place. That's the issue, and I think that the agreements as they were negotiated and signed, went from NAFTA on to everything else. They can and they should have provisos in there. For example, that insist that all workers adhere to International Labor Organization conventions on the right of assembly, for example, or other things of that sort. And I mean, you could structure them in such a way that they would create an environment of higher wages and more democratic responsiveness. That hasn't been the case. Maybe you could make the argument, well, it's impossible to do that. So the better thing would just be to end the idea of international trade. I think, and I would say that right now, yes, I would say the default position of labor in the left should be to be against any new trade agreements, because until we've worked out how you can create them so that they protect labor and the environment, let's not do them. And certainly they haven't done that. They aren't doing that right now. Most of them, they're all about protecting intellectual property mainly. That's one of the main things that they're about. Is it a totally mistake? Well, I mean, the 19th century was a century of globalization. Trade was much more important in the 19th century than it was in the mid 20th century. And Marx had an understanding of the worldwide nature of the bourgeoisie. So it's not impossible to create a social democratic movements when you have a globalized economy, and that did happen in the late 19th century and up to World War I. So I think that's possible. But clearly the conditions under which trade takes place have to be politically structured.
Are there efforts underway to sort of respond with a global unionization effort?
Well, that's a little strong. I mean, it's not a global. I mean, there are indexes, and usually now of unions in other countries helping in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. the U.S. labor movement, which used to be, we're gonna help create democratic unionism in some other country. It's just the opposite now because we're too weak. There are efforts. I mean, the most interesting one right now, of course, is the German IG Metall, which is saying, look, if these German companies are going to establish all these auto plants in the American South, we at the very least want them to have work councils, and I mean, you know, if you and your listeners are familiar with the mess in Chattanooga, and you know, that's an instructive example of how difficult that is. Whereas it was very clear that both Volkswagen wanted to have the work council work, and therefore it was willing to have the UAW win a union election, but the local political establishment was completely against it, and that's true in other instances. So it's difficult to have that international solidarity. But what's remarkable is the United States, when it comes to ILO conventions on freedom of assembly, the U.S. is in there with communist China, mainland China, and a few Saudi and Gulf states not having ratified freedom of association, and we don't do it because basically the Republican Party in the South said no, we're basically against it. We're against freedom of association. So the U.S. sort of writes these conventions, but we never ratify them.
Okay, let's take it back, and maybe can you explain the concept for our listeners of industrial democracy and also the labor question?
Yeah, well, these are historically rooted and contextualized ideas, which really, from the late 19th century, when you had when the rise of both large corporations with lots of money and power. Violence was taking place. There was no law. There was, or the law was quite hostile to any kind of unions were considered conspiracies. Companies were, of course, autocratically run. The right of an employer to fire a worker for good cause, no cause, or cause morally wrong was enshrined in the law. So, at that, in that moment, from the 1880s to the 1930s, first of all, the phrase, the labor question, was bandied about. When you have the question after an issue, like the woman question, the Negro question, the servant question, what it means it's how is the middle class thinking about a problem which seems insoluble at the moment or difficult to solve. So the labor question was the question of the day. In my book I quote Woodrow Wilson, who says, writing in 1919, the question before us of all more than important than any other, and this is in the aftermath of World War I, is the question of labor, and how it will be sustained and high standard of living. So that was an issue. Today I would say the labor question is returned absolutely. Whether we talk about the 1%, the 99%. We talk about stagnant wages. We talk about a kind of the whole pathologies that exist at work in terms of part-time work. No one has sort of labeled this the labor question, but clearly everything that was on the agenda in 1880, immigration, etc., has returned in full force. So I think that it just doesn't have it hasn't been encapsulated in terms of that and that question. But then of course the phrase industrial democracy was a phrase that it wasn't socialism, although you could be a socialist and call for industrial democracy, but it clearly wasn't socialism. But it did mean the democratization, the bringing into the workplace of the kind of norms, the kind of bourgeois norms that we think about in civil society. You're innocent until proven guilty. You're kind of a certain right to vote and have a say in the affairs of the day, a certain kind of autonomy of the individual, etc. All of that was one of the ideas, and I think that it could be very radical. It could be quite radical. Again, kind of socialist, but also, and what makes both one of its virtues and maybe its problems was that it could be quite in the hands of conservatives. It could be used. So John D. Rockefeller, in the aftermath of the Ludlow massacre, he said, "We're going to bring industrial democracy to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company in Colorado, that I own, and I created an employee representation plan, and et cetera. So, in one sense, sort of like Occupy,
Mhm.
it's good to have a movement which makes demands which are so broad that that lots of people can claim them. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize. I could go on about this if you'd like. I mean, about what happened to that, if you'd like me to. That idea, why it went into eclipse, but. I got
Well,
to stop for a moment here.
well, sure. I was wondering actually if you're familiar with
Okay.
Mar.
Let me say. Here's what, just in a shorthand, I'll say what happened.
Mhm.
Again, this idea of industrial democracy, which could be quite radical and quite and could appeal to a lot of different people. When in the 30s, when collective bargaining had existed for many years, but in the 30s we got the Wagner Act and the official structures, which were quite effective for a while. The industrial democracy kind of segued over, uh, and it was replaced by the phrase collective bargaining. That's really, in a
Mm.
sense, what happened. And it was a kind of initially not necessarily a conservatization of that. I mean, collective bargaining in the U.S. Steel Company was a radical thing, and the same is true at General Motors. But and its meaning was radical. Its reality was radical. It was quite striking. I mean, that's what lots of labor historians have written about this. The kind of the really democratization of the shop floor. I've written about it. I've celebrated it. But it was collective bargaining, and then this was linked to a theory of democracy. Democracy is a kind of pluralism of interest groups, jockeying for power, and labor was one of them. But business and shippers and consumers were others. So over the next 2 decades, really the radicalism is leached out of collective bargaining, and
Mm.
the word is no longer heard. So I just finished a book on the Students for Democratic Society and the Port Huron Statement, and their invention of the phrase participatory democracy, and this is in 1962, is a way of reanimating the idea of democracy. The old League for Industrial Democracy, which was the parent group of the SDS, founded in 1905. Clearly, that concept, that idea, had been decimated, destroyed as a radical idea. So they were looking for another way of animating, and so participatory democracy was their phrase, which was counterposed to kind of classic pluralism and even to collective bargaining. So every generation, we do need new ways of expressing the idea of democracy.
I wonder if you would consider Marxist economist Richard D. Wolff's sort of crusade for what he calls democracy at work and the use of workers'
Well, that's
self-directed
a new, yes,
enterprise.
of course.
That's
I mean,
the
that's a new way of, yes, of course. And I mean, I read a book on Walmart. I mean, anything that would just marginally increase the capacity of Walmart workers to have a say over their shift or anything.
hmm
We don't have to talk about unions or anything. Just anything that would enable would be enormous. Actually would throw a wrench into the Walmart business model. Actually,
hmm
and it would be very important. I mean, I'm struck by the sophistication of the Walmart management, or that of really lots and lots of companies, in understanding that what they want to avoid at all costs is even the beginning, the inklings of any democratic movement. So
mm
it's like, it reminds me of what slaveholders did back in the slaveholders, when they had church services, they wanted all the slaves to be Christians, but they didn't want to have them to have their own churches. So there was always, either a white minister or whites would they never allowed the slaves to congregate by themselves. Well, the same is true at Walmart. The one thing that's absolutely certain is you can never allow the workers to congregate by themselves without a minder or a manager, because once that happens, then grievances will be expressed and all hell will break loose. So they're very sophisticated about that, and so I'm in favor of anything that'll give, for example, putting notices up in the break room, or allowing workers, more than 3 of them, to congregate in the parking lot. I mean, this is like living in a totalitarian society, and
mm
you begin to have a little bit of a change, and the whole thing can crack open.
Well, my final question for the evening, Nelson, is towards the end of the book, State of the Union. You start to discuss some prescriptions to revitalize the labor movement, and one of the things that you talk about is sort of a shift in goals, say from advocating for a shorter workday, which seems less relevant to workers today, and shifting that to a reliable 40-hour week and a reliable schedule. And you talk about three things in particular: militancy, institutional democracy within unions, and the use of politics. And I wonder if you could just briefly break down what you mean by each of those things.
Well, let me just say, first of all, yeah, clearly one thing that's emerged absolutely central is that a reliable shift is like much even more important than wages for this everyone in the service sector. I mean, that's absolutely central. So, I mean, I think that's sort of the new hours question today. Okay, the 8-hour day 100 years ago was the question, but today it's a reliable shift. Secondly, well, yes, I think unquestionably militancy, that you need a space for militancy and to encourage those who are most active. At most times, most workers, most unionists, of course, are not going to be militant. I mean, they have a routine, they have a world to live in, they have a family. But we need to create spaces, whether it's young people or whatnot, where a kind of militant activism can be expressed. And sometimes the union contract constrains that. And so we need to do it outside of it. And I think, we've seen some examples of that. The fast food campaign to some extent is that, although it's run on high by SEIU, but nevertheless, it has opened the door for this kind of disruptive militancy. I think that's important. The union leadership has to be embarrassed occasionally by like the Occupy people who want to shut down the port of Oakland, and or what have you. They got to tolerate embarrassment by their militant left wing. That's one thing. Secondly is obviously internal union democracy. And here, I mean, I've been in, this is, you can say it, but how do you ensure it? And but there are certain institutional mechanisms that can be done. It was a travesty what happened here in California when SEIU put its most militant and progressive local, and a big one, in a trusteeship, and that was just a blunder. And I mean, I think the disaster that happened there and set back the union movement in many ways here in California. If that's an object lesson to lots of union leaders, say in the AFT, where the people in Washington really are a bit askance at some of the militants in Chicago, but I think that they have not cracked down because they know the damage would be greater. So you need that realm of internal democracy, absolutely essential. And then of course politics. I mean here, we need this. We discussed this earlier. A kind of a place for kind of independent political initiatives, if not a full-blown party, but we need that space. And for example, right now, I hope that Karen Lewis runs against Rahm Emanuel for the mayor of Chicago. She'd probably lose, but I don't care. That's important. She should just stake out her ground and challenge this centrist Democrat.
Like we saw with Zephyr Teachout in New York, right? She started to challenge the status quo.
Yes, absolutely. That was very instructive. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us here on the Soapbox. Nelson Lichtenstein, MacArthur Chair of History. Thank you so much for being here.
Delighted. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Have a wonderful evening.
Okay, good. You too. Bye-bye.